I shake my head, but I'm not surprised. Calling my sort of discourse uncivil isn't just a gaffe. It's a conscious statement of institutional values of neoliberalism, which requires dogged political supervision. Colonization is central to the conditions of neoliberalism on and off campus. The university's actions are a deliberate attack on the fields of American Indian and Indigenous studies. As throughout American history, natives are an inconvenience to a grander democratic vision that cannot be realized without violence, and that erases the elements of indigeneity that it cannot appropriate. The assumption underlying every justification of the administration's decision is that indigenous peoples cannot make autonomous decisions. They require the oversight of their more sage and responsible superiors. It's a perfect allegory of federal Indian policy, only it's not actually allegorical. A final word on civility. Even if we reduce the term to the crude, coercive context in which university administrators deploy it, something we should never do, those administrators still end up on the wrong side. Cheerleaders of civility have been utterly vicious throughout this affair, which always happens when Zionist groups target scholars and students. Palestinians and their allies face barrages of racist invective and verbal abuse to go along with the more civilized practices of microaggression and character assassination. The advocates of civility are particularly nasty toward women of color. A white male told Jody Bird at Choctaw good riddance after she'd expressed concern about the administration's actions at a public forum. Christopher Kennedy boorishly dismissed Ojibwe Jeannie O'Brien in a much circulated email, suggesting that her only useful contribution would be silence. Somebody told a Palestinian student activist that he wanted to make lots of Muslim babies with her. I could go on, but I don't need to. People of color are fully familiar with these sorts of indignities, which do not emerge from the civilized world so much as they define it. On the other hand, the kindness and generosity of the uncivilized has been stunning. There are hundreds of Arab stereotypes, one of which, in my experience, is entirely true. We express love through food. I've been offered more to eat since my firing pin. Really. In fact, folks of all backgrounds have offered unbelievable hospitality. People have offered money, homes, encouragement, acupuncture, yoga via Skype. You know, it's been, in a word, love. Let's look at an apparently trenchant word: students. The administration is doing everything for the students, right? Never mind that students have been rigorously patronized and infantilized, but which students are administrators purporting to help? Let me point out two things. One, that the students in this instance aren't communities of actual human beings, but an invention of university management. And two, that it is the most privileged among the student body who are beneficiaries of the administration's magnanimity. Students of color, queer and transsexual students, low-income students, students in the margins. Management never includes them in its deliberations. They are useful only insofar as the conceits of multiculturalism can foreclose real democratic participation. No matter how much tuition these students pay, no matter how much they contribute to the vibrancy of intellectual life on campus, they can never be students quite as authoritatively as their normative counterparts. This is a problem of access and representation on many campuses. UIUC is happy to feature American Indian Studies in its diversity pamphleteering, but is much less eager to support even nominal acts of departmental sovereignty. Students on the margins, in fact, are constantly made to justify their existence in the elegant spaces of academe. Take the oft-repeated contention that Jewish students would be uncomfortable in my classes. I leave aside the assumption that discomfort is somehow inimical to a useful education, and the qualifications of Gentiles to decide who is or isn't Jewish. I would never wish on Jewish students even a hint of acrimony toward their ethnic backgrounds. One reason why it's so discomfiting that they are homogenized as proto-Zionists in this characterization of my pedagogy. I oppose the policies of the State of Israel. That's the extent of my engagement with Jewish culture, which is to say I have very little engagement with it at all and don't feel particularly invested in it. If people feel attacked on a cultural level when somebody condemns a nation state, then that's a problem of ethno-nationalism, not of political critique. There's nothing in my record as a scholar or teacher that indicates even a scintilla of anti-Semitism. I go on record, again, to say that I detest the phenomenon. But take any Zionist ideologue, and there are many of them running classrooms. They support, at least tacitly, ethnic cleansing, military occupation, displacement, home demolition, ethnocracy, in short, a profoundly undemocratic state whose violations of human rights are well documented. How are Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim students to feel in one of their classes? It's not just an oversight or disconnect we're dealing with here. It's a profound structural problem of disparate power based on ethnicity and religion. In my case, an imagined hostility devoid of evidence is enough to summarily fire me. But in the case of the Zionist instructor, the support of racial violence is actually real. The fact that nobody ever asks about the comfort of the Arab or Muslim student in the first place illuminates how deeply ingrained Zionist violence is in the mythologies of civility and responsible pedagogy. It's always the marginal, the undesirable, the wretched, who must justify their humanity to the majority. The structural violence of the normative, meanwhile, gets to define itself as benign. Why anyway must folks who have never uttered an anti-Semitic statement constantly make our opposition to anti-Semitism explicit? Nobody else has to proclaim opposition to things they've never endorsed. More important, why don't those who repeatedly disparage Palestinians ever have to answer to their troublesome beliefs? I'd love to see folks who condone the slaughter of children and the illegal settlement of foreign territory disavow themselves of anti-Arab racism. It's because Israel, like the whiteness it epitomizes, is the default norm of civility. Israelis are assumed to be human. To criticize them then is inherently aggressive. Palestinians, on the other hand, must loudly denounce aggression at every imaginable moment in order to be considered human in the first place, even as we suffer the unrelenting violence of Israeli colonization. Our barbarity is atavistic and imminent. It precedes our subjectivity, restricts our earthly presence, and marks us as inferior. We can achieve the lofty status of pitiable only when we grovel. We constitute a species that must genuflect in order to earn the trust of those by whom we are conquered and defined.